Ula Vinaka, namaste. Good morning, everyone. Morning. How are you all? Nice to be here with you this morning. Nice to be at USP again. Thank you to the two previous speakers for their keynote. And welcome to our distinguished panel for this morning, where we're exploring the foundations of climate change. My name is Christian Nielsen. I'm the Executive Director of the Live and Learn Pacific Network. We are a network in 13 countries in the Pacific, and we are basically spending our lives on building climate resilience. This morning, we're going to explore what the foundations of climate resilience are, their implications, and I'm really keen to have a highly interactive time with the audience where you can interact with our esteemed speakers who's got a wealth of knowledge in nature-based solutions, health, practice. Soon we are welcoming an Indigenous knowledge expert as well, who'll be sitting next to Doris. And also I believe we have Sandika on board. Good morning, Sandika, how are you?
Lovely, thank you. Good morning.
My apologies, you might only be able to see the back of my head, which has become very bold, but I hope you don't mind. Apologies. Sandika is from a civil engineering perspective. Maybe before I let the esteemed panelists introduce themselves, I want to just give a little bit of framing around the session today. And I want to first give an incentive to all of you why we cannot fail in our endeavor to build climate resilience in the Pacific Islands. So I'm an underwater filmmaker. I lived 6 years in Morova Lagoon in the late 80s, early 90s, where I was filming for National Geographic. And I was already then very concerned about the state of coral reefs in Morova Lagoon. Now, at the moment, science tells us that the climate will stabilize at 2.6 degrees pre-industrial levels. That is what we're currently predicting, should all science be correct. If we're doing what we're doing now, it will stabilize at 2.6 degrees. That's the best guess. Now, at 2 degrees, coral reefs, they die out. And we already see 2/3 of coral reefs on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia have bleached. And in the Pacific, about 90% of coral reefs will die out if we go over 2 degrees pre-industrial levels. That flow-on impact will mean that fisheries habitats in coastal areas of the Pacific will decline by 50%. Imagine what that would do to migration and stability across the Pacific. So resilience is about counteracting and withstanding what may be, hopefully not, but what may be a looming coral crisis that are ahead of us. Now, I'm not saying this to depress everyone. I'm saying it to fire you up and really understand the incentive there is for all of us to really lean into this space with everything we have. Now, Live and Learn is an organization that are dealing in terms of building climate resilience. And what we have learned over the last 30 years are 3 things that are fundamental ingredients in succeeding in building resilience at the community level. 1, we have to localize development. So you look at COP29, you look at COP16 in Baku and Colombia, respectively. That was the key message that came out from all policymakers. We have to localize development. And what does localization mean? It means we have to transfer the power to local communities and to local organizations. It can no longer be held in Australia, New Zealand, and the US. You've got to localize it. And we're going to expand the strength that local communities and local organizations have to claim the space of development and leading development programs. We have to use local knowledge, and I'm very pleased that we are welcoming soon an Indigenous knowledge expert who will talk about how do we expand Indigenous knowledge as a powerful weapon to build resilience and climate change adaptation. So Indigenous knowledge is fundamental. And also we have to emphasize and enhance a sense of being in communities. There is a spiritual connection between Pacific Islanders and their land that has to be at the center of localization. The second pillar that we have learned is alliance building. We have to collaborate. NGOs, universities can no longer compete with each other. We have to acknowledge each other's strengths, and we have to build collaboration across a whole variety of different sectors. And that is, I know being working in an NGO, that's a very, very difficult thing for NGOs to do because we constantly compete. And often collaboration is not at the forefront of our mind. The third pillar is we have to be fearless. We have to be absolute fearless. What do we mean by fearless? By fearless, we don't mean careless, but we have to take risks all the time. And we have to fall in love with rejection. We have to fall in love with rejection because we will get our efforts rejected a lot. And if you fall in love with rejection, you expand your comfort zone and you see failures not as failures, but as a means of growing into the challenge. And I think talking to lots of young people across the Asia-Pacific region, climate anxiety is a reality. And we have to not only look at building climate resilience in our communities and in our countries and islands, we also have to build climate resilience within ourselves and have a really strong mental clarity around what we need to do in order to succeed. So when people, they are often saying, they often ask, are you optimistic or pessimistic in relation to climate change? That is the wrong question. All that matters is we know what we need to do. How do we do it? That's the thing. All right. On that note, I am very pleased to welcome Veronica, and I've actually asked each speaker to introduce themselves so they can do justice to their own experience and their own profession. I'm going to turn to you, Veronica, first. You are very scholared and knowledgeable in the area of nature-based solutions to climate change. And we've talked about coral reefs. I'm very keen to hear from you. How do we frame nature-based solutions, and what can nature-based solutions do to build climate resilience in the Pacific? Thank you.
Hello? Oh, yeah. Okay. Hello, thank you for that introduction, Christian, and for framing the discussion. My name is Veronica Lowe. I'm a senior policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. It's an international think tank, and it's based in Canada, but we are all over the world. And I'm particularly based in Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. Our organization is focused on sustainable development, but more specifically in the program I work for, it's called Resilience. So this is an interesting and very relevant program for us to be coming in here and talking a bit about our perspective and how we frame resilience. And so one of the questions that Christian had asked is, how do you differentiate between all these terms, resilience, climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and they're all very interrelated. And resilience, of course, really comes from the idea of a system being able to recover and withstand shocks from climate change or other drivers, the pandemic. So A resilient community is really a community that's cohesive, that has strong social bonds and has strong governance systems that are equitable and transparent, and that have systems in place that can prepare and withstand these shocks. And so I guess when we think about nature-based solutions, it's a term that's fraught with a lot of complexity, and there's a lot of history behind the term. And there's a lot of related terms that, that some of you would be more familiar with, locally led adaptation, ecosystem-based adaptation, disaster risk reduction. And all of these different terms, sometimes we get so caught up in the terminology, but it's really the impact and the outcomes that matter, right? You're addressing some challenge such as adaptation to climate change, but in a way that's equitable and transparent and inclusive. And given that it's called nature-based solutions, of course, we're looking at an enhanced resilience of those ecosystems that provide these essential services that, filtrate water, that act as when you restore wetlands, for example, it acts as a sponge that can actually increase floodwater capacity. And so that protects coastal communities. And there are so many examples of where we can invest more in restoration and conservation. But we also want to ensure that we don't think about nature-based solutions as the be-all and the one solution for adaptation. I think if you look at the terminology for ecosystem-based adaptation, it's really about ensuring that it's one part of an overall adaptation strategy, and that the non-nature-based solutions, such as early warning systems, are also critically important. It's about putting it all together in a holistic and inclusive adaptation strategy. So I'll just start with that because I'm sure the other panelists would like to speak as well. So let me know, Christian, if you would like me to expand or if you are...
Just a quick question on that. What are the main barriers to nature-based solutions at the moment? What are the key constraints?
Well, as you mentioned, it's about leaning in, being fearless, experimenting, and not being afraid of failure. There's quite a lot of evidence, but as you mentioned as well, we need collaboration, we need those alliances, and we need to recognize all kinds of knowledge systems. And I'm sure our colleague later on will talk about Indigenous knowledge systems, but we are here. How do we bridge the gap between science and policy? And how do we work all together cohesively and not work in silos? Another barrier is, of course, the financing part of it. So there's the evidence base, of course, that we need to consolidate, and we need to work with the existing evidence that we have. There is, of course, studies that show what happens when you protect and restore those coral reefs, experiments from universities that show that those coral reefs actually have a function in reducing storm wave intensity. And so when we have that evidence base, we have to work with that and experiment and implement. And the financing is one part of it, but it's about a whole of government and whole of society approach. This is the approach that's being recognized in the Global Biodiversity Framework. There was the CBD COP, Convention on Biological Diversity conference that just took place in Colombia, where, one part of their global biodiversity framework that countries have adopted is this whole of society, whole of government approach. And that includes engaging with the private sector. We know that from the last negotiations that financing was a major sticking point, and committing to resource mobilization and looking at different and innovative ways of financing nature-based solutions that would be very important. Engaging with the private sector is quite essential in order to ensure that we can upscale nature-based solutions.
So just a quick question on that before we go to talk about the health and climate resilience. So one thing that a lot of organizations, they are stuck on is how to engage with the private sector on something that does not necessarily bring them a direct profit, like nature-based solutions. How do you make the argument to the private sector to lean into nature-based solutions? And at the moment, we have 30% of terrestrial and non-terrestrial system that needs to be protected in order for ecosystems to sustain. What argument do we make to the private sector?
Well, interestingly enough, we have a private sector partner that we're working with who's in the audience today. We were here as part of a consortium called Aquadapt that's being supported by the Government of Canada, International Development Research Council of Canada, and Global Affairs Canada. And as part of our consortium, we are looking at ways to engage the private sector. We are working directly with a private sector partner in Fiji, in Savu in Vanuatu, to implement community-led edible pearl oyster farms. And when we have been speaking with our partner, Justin Hunter from J. Hunter Pearls, one of the risks that he always mentions is, to recognize that and share the risks that the private sector has in investing in nature-based solutions. And that includes addressing issues like having insurance, looking at inclusive governance models for these community-led oyster farms, and to engage in equitable and transparent ways so that everyone can benefit.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Veronica. And please write down your questions as they come to mind, and you can ask Veronica a little bit later about it. Now, Aditya, yes, the links between climate resilience and health are becoming more and more evident as we are striving towards building resilience. Infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases, all are a concern. How are we having to think about health within the climate resilience space?
Thanks very much, Christian. And Nisa Bulavinaka, everyone. Great to be back in Fiji. Weirdly enough, I live in Sydney, but I've been in Fiji 3 times this year and in Perth 3 times this year. It takes 5 hours to get in both directions. So, either I'm perfectly placed or, I'm really blessed to be here on this side of the ocean. Folks, I'm a humble doctor. I trained in clinical medicine. You see patients around you that need care. And then one day I was sitting in an intensive care unit working. It was night shift. It's kind of not so busy. So I opened a book, and the book I opened was Introduction to Public Health. So I studied a Master of Public Health, and that really changed the way I thought about the big picture upstream determinants or causes of health. And so, all the wonderful stuff you said just now, Veronica, around nature-based solution, the human being in the natural and built environment, that's what determines health. It's determined in society, not necessarily individual choice. So anyway, I'm a public health doctor. I've worked in a couple of different places, including the Ministry of Health in Sydney. And also I had the great privilege of working with the Fiji Ministry of Health last year to develop the Health National Adaptation Plan for Climate Change, which has just freshly been published only a few days ago, or maybe 1 week ago at COP29 in Baku. So I'll talk a bit about that in a second. But I wonder if we can do an experiment, taking a leaf out of your book, Christian. Can we close our eyes and just tell me what image comes to your mind when you think about climate resilience? Just the image. There must be a picture in your mind. I'll give you a second. I'll close my eyes as well. What's the image? If someone's brave in the audience, do you want to tell me what you see? 1 word, 2 words. Darkness. Ooh, up there, red shirt. Yeah, agriculture, crops. Very good. 1 more. There's another hand somewhere. Yep. What's the picture? Give us a photograph. People. Yeah. So I'm really glad you came to that point. And actually, I was hoping no one said people, because if we think about sustainability and the triple bottom line, right? The financial bottom line, the social bottom line, and the environmental, it's kind of hard to figure out what is the social. And we often forget that. We think about the financial bottom line for our organizations, even in health. We're driven by our budget, which is growing. We're driven by ambulance services that we need to fund, or fancy new technology we need to procure in order to treat new diseases. But really, it comes back down to people. So when people talk about resilience, I'd love this conversation as well around what does resilience in the natural environment look like and how health can benefit from that. But I can definitely tell you very plain and simple how the health sector, this is the question, how the health sector sees climate resilience. So it's quite straightforward. in the health system, the World Health Organization, for example, has this concept of the 6 building blocks of a health service, right? It's not rocket science. It's not neurosurgery. It's very simple. We need good leadership. We need a health workforce to deliver care. We need infrastructure like hospital buildings or clinics or virtual care, right? That's all infrastructure. We need technologies and products like medicines, surgical devices, implements. We also need really good health intelligence or information systems, because if there's an outbreak of COVID-19 or measles somewhere, we need to know how many people are affected, where they are, time, place, person type statistics. So that's not particularly difficult. Just in the last 10 years or so, World Health Organization has expanded that framing to have 10 components of what a climate resilient and environmentally sustainable health system can look like. And it just expands on some of those things. So for example, early warning systems. When there's a cyclone that's going to come through our islands, or a bushfire that's going to come through the eastern seaboard of New South Wales and Victoria in Australia, we need to be able to predict that. We need to be able to inform people, and we need to take action. So there's some of the sort of high-level approaches of how the health system sees resilience to climate change. It's actually incredibly difficult to work on that and to actually do something different, because there's such a necessary sort of conservatism built into health and how we manage it. So if you do a quick change in the way you treat a patient, or a quick change in the pathway of care, you might have some downstream impacts that you didn't anticipate. So it's quite a slow-moving, kind of a canonical sort of approach to implementing change in health. But the very scary part for some of us who are deeply working on this is we don't have time now to adapt. In fact, adaptation is happening on the run. So I'll expand a bit on that later as well, but that's the high-level response to how does the health system see resilience. It's 6 building blocks of what a good health system looks like, and then we have the overlay of climate change on top. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So can you give an example about what a good health outcome looks like in the context of climate change?
That's a very big and deep question.
We are very deep.
Let me give you some simple examples from some of the research work I do. So I wear 2 hats. I work as a public health doctor in our health service in Canberra, the national capital. I'm also at the University of Canberra, where we have a research network called HEAL, Healthy Environments and Lives. Now, the exciting thing there is, for the first time in ages, in 2021, the Australian Government National Medical Research Council funded a specific set of activities, this network on climate change and health. What does it look like for the health system? So I'll just tell you a few projects that our team and our broader network around Australia is up to. One example is looking at housing. So we know the places where we live, wherever we are in the world, can determine health. So how are our homes able to cope with extremely hot weather events, so heat waves? And what are the reasons why people get sick in their homes? Actually, do they have alternatives? So I know in Canada, for example, there's a lot of work around cooling shelters for heat waves and bushfires. So during your wildfires, you have clean air shelters. In Australia, we haven't really become quite mature on that topic. So that's something we're exploring. What I'm describing to all of you now is not actually a health service, is it? It's actually health in the population. So that's what we talk about in public health. It's public or population level health, which gets created in the community, not necessarily in a hospital setting. You might like another example. So air pollution is a big focus for us. Heat wave is a big focus for us. Infectious diseases is important as well. Australia learnt from the pandemic response, and we've been doing some work with our National Department of Health on setting up the new Australian CDC, Centre for Disease Control. So we know, and maybe some of you read this in the last 2 years, there's something called Japanese encephalitis virus. It's quite a bad kind of hemorrhagic virus where you get it, and then it's a little bit like Ebola. You start bleeding out from various orifices. So not a great disease to have. Carried by a mosquito. That mosquito now has traveled all the way down into southern Australia, which A, we didn't know, so we didn't have early warning, but B, in fact, our early warning systems failed, you can say. But B, the climate has changed and it's enabled this to happen. So when you ask a question like that, the reason it's so deep and difficult is this is almost a whole of government, whole of society, multi-industry or multi-sector approach we need to take. I'm not going to say health struggles with it. In fact, health does an admirable job, I think, in any country, speaking to other sectors. But we just need to ramp that up, do more of it, do it smarter. Again, our time is running out.
Sounds good. Well, it doesn't sound good, but thank you for
Sounds terrible.
thank you for that. And we'll come back. One thing I would like you to think about as we're sort of progressing through the panel is how we can support young people's mental health in building resilience to climate change. It's a very, very big issue. But Sandika, you're still with us. Thank you for being so patient, and sorry that you could not be with us in person today. Very keen to hear from you the interfaces between climate resilience and engineering. I have to say that the international community is very, very keen on physical infrastructure across the Pacific, and we can see why. There's lots of risk to roads and bridges and buildings. Very keen to hear your perspective around the sort of primary resilience risk associated with climate change that civil engineers needs to consider as they're working in the Pacific today. Thank you, Sandika.
Great. Thank you, Christian. And so lovely to join you guys. And yes, I am very sad I couldn't be there in person. I love Fiji. So yeah, obviously, as a civil engineer, so I come at this from a civil engineering perspective. There is a lot of, I guess, responsibility that, you know, civil engineers kind of feel like they face in terms of making our built environment resilient to climate change. And I think the one of the biggest shortfalls that we're facing as civil engineers being able to work in this space successfully is the fact that we are very much used to things being a certain way and our maths equations working really predictably and being able to know the inputs reliably so that we can therefore design a reliable, you know, outcome or output. And what climate change is doing to us is it's kind of changing the whole game. So it's changing all our inputs. And what we work, and as a civil engineer, I work specifically in the disaster management and climate resilience space. And therefore I do a lot of work around risk as well, understanding risk. And what we're facing at the moment is that climate change is making our risk very unpredictable. So our hazards, the frequency, the likelihood, the magnitude of our hazards are all changing and kind of, you know, veering in the space of unpredictability, which means we don't have reliable sort of inputs to design for. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that if we have to build infrastructure that is resilient to climate change, oftentimes now we no longer know what exactly those parameters are that we're building to. So there's a lot of kind of variation that happens based on, you know, what type of climate models we choose. And there's, yeah, so it's causing a lot of issues in the civil engineering space. And one of the pieces of work that we're working on is how would engineers design for unknown unknowns? And that is really the terminology that we're starting to use to describe risk associated with climate change, unknown unknowns. Sometimes we don't even know what the hazards are that might turn up. We don't know how they're going to interact with each other. We're still learning about the cascading impacts of one hazard leading to something else, leading into something else. And we don't know how much of it is there, when it's going to happen. So how would an engineer design for unknown unknowns? And so this is definitely a challenge. So we're trying to rethink how can we actually have a more resilient approach to design. So that means we're basically changing how we understand these inputs and how we design in the first place. And also leaning on concepts like understanding that maybe the built environment can't actually solve everything. So how do we work in different ways? How do we think in different ways? Like we spoke about earlier, how do we bring in nature-based solutions into civil engineering and working with nature? How do we work better with communities? How do we actually integrate indigenous knowledge that might have different ways of thinking that can be complementary to civil engineering practice? So that is really the space. And then, of course, the other issue that we have to deal with is the cost of these things. So when we're designing for unknown unknowns and we're trying to have a lot of contingency for many different things, that leads us to what our limitations and constraints in terms of things like cost and resources that we have as well. So it's a very, very challenging time, basically. But the biggest thing is just really rewiring kind of that engineering thinking into being more open and flexible and more holistic.
Thank you, Sandika. So if we had a civil engineering student in the audience today, and he's asking, or she's asking for your advice in relation to how do we design for the unknown unknowns? 3 pieces of very quick advice.
Well, first of all, step back and think big, think outside the box. Try to understand the big picture. And this is a piece of work that I constantly work on. What are all the pieces of this puzzle? Who is actually impacted by what I do? Not just your specific project or your client, but what are the other cascading? Who else as a larger community who is impacted by what you're doing? So when you try to understand, step back and understand the situation, then you can kind of start to think more about all the things you might need to consider, first of all. The second thing is, how can we actually think differently in the sense of work outside the limitations that we have? So instead of designing our way into a solution, are there other ways that we can think of tackling this problem? For instance, oftentimes we, as civil engineers, focus on maybe strengthening a particular bridge, and that's all we focus on. We think if we just make this bridge as strong as possible, then that is what the solution is going to be. But maybe the solution is not the bridge. Maybe the solution is a bridge or a couple of bridges, couple of roads, we're talking about access to a particular place, using more of a network approach. So rather than thinking about single pieces of assets or infrastructure, thinking about a bigger network approach, what are different things that we can use to solve, whatever that issue is that we're looking at. And thirdly, what are some solutions beyond engineering that could actually help? Who else can we talk to? Can we work with planners? Can we work with, health officials or social scientists and indigenous knowledge experts? Who else can we bring into this equation to come up with a better solution? And so not just think that as a civil engineer, you can solve this on your own, which is what often happens.
Yes. No, thank you so much, Sandika. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions from the audience. We're just going to go through our remaining 2 panelists, and then we're going to show a short video by a board member of GDN, Mr. Patrick Guillemont, and then we're going to get into some questions as well. Now, Doris, you've been leading Live and Learn for more than a decade. Live and Learn's work in Fiji is very, very community oriented. Can you talk a little bit about how Live and Learn is delivering climate resilient actions on the ground and some of the things that you have found profoundly important in that delivery? What have we learned over the last 10 years that you can share with our colleagues this morning, Anaka?
Thank you. Thank you, Christian and Bulavinaka, everyone. I must acknowledge the panelists that have contributed previously. I think something that's come strong out of the conversations that we've had is the people-centered approach. And Live and Learn as a non-government organization based here in Fiji, and I manage the Fiji Country Program, but as Christian had mentioned, we're present in about 13 countries across the Pacific. So whilst we are based here in Fiji, our learnings are not limited to just the Fiji or the Fijian context. So we learn a lot also from our counterparts across the Pacific, where there are similarities and if differences are present, then how do we learn about those differences? So one of our biggest learning with the organization since we were established is that we must ensure that our work is people-centered, and that's where the strength-based approach is usually actually facilitated. So when we talk about people, it's about acknowledging that there is a lot of wisdom in our communities. And whilst we may rightfully acknowledge that with climate change, there are many issues that also have our people, our communities exposed to, we also need to acknowledge the wisdom, their history, their historical knowledge, their beginnings. And so I would just like to probably share a flagship program that Live and Learn has across, at present, 6 countries in the Pacific. And this is a program that is funded by the New Zealand government. It is the Climate Resilient Islands program. And so something that we've also learned as a network, which we've implemented here in Fiji, is with NGOs, you know, we bid for funding, we apply for funding, and they are usually funding envelopes that perhaps, if we're lucky, lasts 5 years, but it could be a year, 2 years, or 3 years at most. And so we don't have much time to actually be working with communities by project. So as an organization, the network approach, as well as the Fiji office approach, we've learned that we can no longer be designing projects independent of each other. So the banner, we have a resilience banner. This particular project, the climate program, the Climate Resilient Islands program, in the 6 countries, they are then contextualized. And I would like to reflect also on a learning. We have learned that we need to, as Christian had mentioned earlier on, we need to localize the work that we do. So contextualizing, working with our local people, our communities. And we also acknowledge the importance of research. I would like to also share that whilst we're not a scientifically researching organization, we do a lot of research at the community level, and consultation, talking with our communities is really very important. And these discussions, they lead into project design, and it connects or it responds to a program. So people-centered, understanding where we've come from as a people, what is it that we are finding that is a priority as priority issues in our communities, and communities, they vary. In Fiji, for example, we work taking the ridge to reef approach. Coastal communities will have their issues, which may be different from those upland. And so that's the learning that we are, that we've got as an organization, is really working with the people, because everything we do as an organization, it's about our people, it's for our people, and it is with our people. So this is how we have been programming. And I'd like to acknowledge the previous speakers who have also acknowledged the importance of considering people, or in our terms, we refer to them as our communities that we work with. So that's one of our big learnings. So just localizing and contextualizing. But what is also important is, whilst we're working with communities, we need to have a supportive environment that we are operating in. And there has been some reference made to partnerships. I like to think that partnerships don't just happen overnight. Taking it back again to communities, we need to develop good working relationships with our communities. So we need to know where we're working, who we're working with, what are their issues, and really work with them and not come in as a development partner and say, perhaps maybe you need this. No, we need to ask them what, and go through that process of really consulting, hearing from our community. So that has developed for Live and Learn over a period of, well, as Christian mentioned, the organization is about 30 years old. And for us here in Fiji, about 25 years old. But really, it's learning to work with people. And so with partnerships, relationships must first be established. And this is partnerships not only with our communities, because as a non-government organization, as I had mentioned, if we're lucky, we get to work with communities for a longer period of time, beyond 3 years. So whilst we are there, we need to ensure that an exit strategy is in place, and the partnerships must also allow for us to have our communities recognize who are these other partners that once Live and Learn leaves the community, that we could continue to work with. And then that also brings in that support for sustainability. So we need to ensure that our partners or our communities are networked. I'll just give you an example of how we do that here in Fiji. So we've got good relationships, working relationships with relevant government agencies. At the moment, our resilience programming works very closely with the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Forestry, and the Ministry of Fisheries. So whilst we work in close partnership with these agencies, it's really not about Live and Learn. It's about Live and Learn facilitating the connection between our partners and our communities. And we work in rural and remote communities where accessing services that are located hundreds of kilometers away from these communities can be a big challenge. So what we have been doing over the last 10 years is really ensuring that our government agencies understand the work that we're doing. So there's a lot of contact with them, but then at the same time, also facilitating our government partners coming into the communities with Live and Learn. And we've seen some outcomes that were unexpected, we didn't expect. For example, we've had small businesses begin to be birthed within communities simply because a government department representative was there and talked about community business as a benefit to communities. So again, it's partnerships providing for our communities a support network when we're there, as well as when we are exit from the communities after a project has been funded. So those are some of our learnings in terms of resilience here in Fiji, and the same approach is taken with our communities in the other countries that we work in.
Tanaka, Doris, and of course there's a workshop on Indigenous resilience planning at 2:30, where we're going to take a deep dive into some of the building blocks for resilience that we're using on the ground, or Live and Learn is using on the ground to enhance local resilience. Simi, warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for making it across the ferry and joining us this morning. We know from Baku, I read all the financing reports. It was supposed to be the finance COP, that out of all the climate finance across the world, 1% goes to Indigenous people, just 1%. Yet Indigenous people are the stewards, has the stewardship of almost 30% of all natural areas, a massive inequality. I'm keen for you to talk into the importance of Indigenous people leading the process. How do we get to that place? We all talk about it. If you go to any donor, any development partner, they all talk about Indigenous people have to lead the development process. Why is it not happening? How can we make it happen? Simi, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I will frame my community Talanoa using the quotation by Eli Wiesel, Holocaust survivor. And I quote, "Without memory, there is no society, no civilization, no future." I also cite, for better for worse, Sir Winston Churchill, Prime Minister, World War II in England, who said, "The further back a person can look, the further forward you can see." And in so saying, to involve indigenous, to allow indigenous communities to lead, imagine a traditional house. There's the foundation, there are the poles, and there the roof. The approaches that are taken to the community are usually just the roof. People forget that roofs are held up by poles, and the poles are pegged on foundation. That foundation, that memory, nobody talks about it because it's never mainstreamed. Due to colonization, our indigenous memory has been sidelined. We've become very good at the modern at the expense of our memories, without which we may have some semblance of society, but we have no notion of resilience. So going to the communities, in order to allow the communities to lead, we need to reframe and understand how indigenous societies view the world. And many, okay, let me put it this way. To understand climate resilience, there's this story, and I tell stories a lot. Two fish in the water, swimming, and an older fish swims past and asks, "Hi guys, how's the water?" and swims off. And one of the younger fish just pauses and the other says, "What's wrong?" The other fish says, "What the hell is water? We are so in it, we don't realize it." In a manner of speaking, when notions of resilience, when notions of sustainability are brought to us, what are you saying? Because we've been swimming in resilience and sustainability, but we can't even notice it. So reframing, the outsider perspectives bring sustainability. We've been doing it for the past 4,000 years. We are so into it. It's like drinking water. It's like breathing. So this is how sustainability is understood. Resilience is understood. We enter through the pathway of how we understand the world, the land. And understanding the land is not just soil, just nothing. It's not a scientific understanding. We see the land as our grandparent. There's an emotional/spiritual dimension to it. The presentations, the ideas that come on a change, they mean well, they are just at the roof. They are not hitting the foundation. How do we as indigenous people understand and view the land? When I say the land, the word for that is vanua. And for us, vanua is literally the ecosystem, the fauna and the flora, the cultural, the biological, and the spiritual dimensions. Presentations, discourses on climate change and resilience, they miss the spiritual and the emotional. And it does not hit home. And when we are asked to lead without articulating or acknowledging our spiritual and emotional understanding, perspectives, worldview, you will not get any indigenous leading in climate change. I'm working with 2 provinces and in trying to get indigenous resilience, but the pathway through it is I go through the indigenous notions of identity. We talk about nature-based solutions, but nobody has realized that we have nature-based identities. What am I saying? Here in Fiji, all the communities, we have three generic totems. There's a sky totem, there's a land totem, and there's a water totem. Some clans have all three. I have. Some clans have one, some clans have two. For sky totem, it's either a bird or insect, something that takes to the wind, to the air. A water totem could be something aquatic or marine. A land totem could be a flower, a root crop, etc. My land totem is a tree. It's a candle, not tree. What that means is I derive my identity. We derive our identity from our grandparent bracket totem. In fact, we consider the land and our totems as our tuakanda, elder siblings. And in so saying, as the younger sibling, the totems embedded in it is our sense of custodianship. We have to ensure that the environment of our water totem and our land totem are looked after. Because if they are not looked after, when they suffer, we also suffer. That's the connectivity. So, in addition to indigenous notions of resilience and leading climate-led resilience, we need to bring into the conversation the notion of our emotional, spiritual, and relational dimensions. Because if we, and sad to say, with due respect, the English language is very devoid of these notions. It's replete in the Fijian language and other Pacific languages. When we talk about relational, the tree is not just a tree. I address the tree as I'm addressing an elderly grandparent. These notions of resilience, when they are not acknowledged, it then shuts us away. And we can go through all the rhetoric, all the science, but you have shut out the indigenous-led initiatives, the worldview, because we never talk about it because it has never been mainstreamed in our thinking, in our education. And because it's not there, we tend to assume it doesn't exist. And I say to the people in the communities, in the villages, it's like gravity. You don't see it, but it's there. And our oral stories, our values, it's not there, but doesn't mean it's not there. So bringing all this, allowing these conversations, because when we're talking about resilience, put it this way, last week I was in a village in the province of Rewa. And in this particular province, we were in this village called Mureonodo. And in the village of Mureonodo, they have this huge taro plants. And they're always with water, or the land is always waterlogged, and they're always resilient crops. And during the conversations, we were talking about heritage, what our ancestors gifted the descendants. One of the elders says, you know, we want to develop this place. I go, oh, great. What do you have in mind? We want to build some more houses. Wonderful. Why are you telling me this? Well, we have no space. Oh, I see. And what's on your mind? We have to clear all these, the other iconic taro plants. I stayed and did not respond. And the elder said, well, what do you think? Or what do I think? Go ahead. Destroy all those via, they call it the via plants. Destroy them. But make sure you have pumps. Why? Because the moment you remove that, all the flood waters underground will come into your land. You will no longer be walking. You'll be traveling by boat from house to house. He looked at me disbelieved. Really? Yes. You think our ancestors were silly to plant this? These are indigenous resilience. That's your identity. Therein is our memory. We've become so good at contemporary memory at the cost of our indigenous memory. So again, to get communities, indigenous communities to lead resilience, the conversation must begin to acknowledge our spiritual, emotional, and relational dimensions. These words are not in the English language. So what am I saying? Translate if you need to, or get somebody to be the interpreter. Otherwise, we cannot begin to make the conversation using one language which is so devoid and try to extract or try to connect with the richer nuances in the indigenous languages, full of, hence, when we ask, when sustainability and resilience is thrown to us, just like the proverbial fish, what the hell is water? We are so into it, we don't recognize it, but at our peril, we've also forgotten. So bringing it to the fore, to allow indigenous communities to lead, we need to lead using our languages and our values. If you bring another language, it must be contextualized, as Doris said. That's just in a nutshell to begin shedding some light on that question. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Master Semi, and really fascinating to hear that perspective. I do have a very tricky question for you, though. We were approached by an NGO in the Solomon Islands recently, and they're working to protect forests. Yeah, and the chief of the village said to this NGO, we want to log the forest and cut down the trees. And it's our indigenous right to do so. The conservation group was pro-indigenous right and pro-conservation. How do they deal with that?
That's the dilemma when when we're talking about rights, it is the Western concept of the individual rights. About indigenous rights, we are talking about the collective rights. Somehow, that is not also understood by us. It's my indigenous right. No, it's not yours. We use these terms in Fijian. Nanonda, nakenda, namenda. Ours to own, ours to share, ours to drink and eat from. So that basically summarizes indigenous rights. It's not an individual thing, it's a collective thing. So this is where the individual and the collective rights
Vinaka, yeah.
I asked.
Yeah, no, Vinaka. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we now have a video to show. I'm supposed to give a signal to someone. Over here. And this is a message. I think it's about 9 minutes long, and it is by Patrick Dumont.
Hello, a good day to everybody.
Oh, and whilst you're watching this, please, if you can think of some questions, the harder the better, to our esteemed panelists, and we'll open up after the video, and we'll try to engage in a dialogue for the remaining 20, 30 minutes. I've got lots of questions, but I want to open it up to our audience, our colleagues, to participate as well. Thank you.
Hello, a good day to everybody, and thanks for inviting me to this important meeting. And I am so sorry not to be with you, but I am in Clermont-Ferrand, and I am happy to take the floor for 2 reasons. First is precisely because the FERDI, I have the privilege to share, has been honored to host the European Office of GDN, and we are here. You are in Fiji. I am. It's 2 parts of the GDN. Second, FERDI, second reason, has been working for many years on vulnerability and resilience issues, in particular with various UN bodies, and in particular these 3 last years, for the preparation of a new multidimensional vulnerability index, which has been endorsed by the UN General Assembly during the last summer. In that perspective, the GN Fiji conference is quite welcome, because it is a good follow-up for this debate. Here we need to come back to the basics. because there are so many confusions about vulnerability, resilience. While we look for a concept of vulnerability and the concept of resilience, noticeably to climate change, likely to be used at the macro level by the international financial institutions for the allocation of their concessional resources. Let me consider first the vulnerability and resilience concept in general. Resilience emerged in development economics many years ago in the framework of vulnerability analysis, and it cannot be separated from vulnerability. Vulnerability is the risk for a country to see its development, now its sustainable development, compromised or hampered by exogenous shocks, either external or natural. And the economists used to distinguish, one, the size and frequency of the shocks, second, the exposure to these shocks, and three, the capacity of the country to react or to cope with the shocks. What is exactly the meaning of resilience? Lack of resilience is simply a part of vulnerability. Second, the country or macro vulnerability is multidimensional according to the origin of the shocks, economic, such as export instability, environmental or climatic, such as sea level rise, and the socio-political, such as violence at the neighbor, in the neighbor countries, or state fragility. And a country cannot be said more vulnerable than another if the three dimensions are not together considered. So the concept and measurement of vulnerability should be also universal, what means relevant for all groups of countries. And this important point has been endorsed by the UN FBI, and noticeably by the seats which wanted to be considered as more vulnerable than other countries, and for that they should be compared to the other countries, and are still considered so with the new MVI. Of course, there may be respective indices for each dimension. For instance, Ferdi set up a physical vulnerability to climate change. But the aggregate index of the three dimensions should fairly reflect this dimension and the specificity of vulnerability for each country, which involves an appropriate averaging of the components. Finally, the resilience or lack of resilience is itself multidimensional, but not by the same way as the three other components of vulnerability. Because at the macro level, the several dimensions of resilience are quite more substitutes, and that means that the macro capacity to cope with shocks is very similar, whatever the kind of shocks to face. Let's look now at the vulnerability and resilience to climate change. Climate resilience, a nice title for a conference such as this one. But frankly, is climate resilience really the problem? The problem is the resilience to climate change, or the lack of resilience to climate change. Climate resilience is a history of mankind and human settlements. Resilience to climate change is a more meaningful concept at the micro level than at the macro level. At the micro level, it refers to specific measures, building houses robust to face floods or earthquake, while at the macro level, it more or less depends on the same factors than resilience to other kinds of shocks. The factors such as education, infrastructure, and more generally, the level of income per capita. For similar reasons, the policy of adaptation to climate change cannot be separated from development policy. Adaptation is a part of development. Even if the resource and needs for adaptation in the climate finance should be mobilized and allocated according to specific rules. My last remarks are about the indices of vulnerability and resilience used for policy purposes. As was agreed at the UN, a good MVI, including climate change, vulnerability, and lack of resilience, should be built so that it can be used as a criterion for the allocation of a concessional resource. So that means that it should be not only multidimensional and universal, but also exogenous or structural, what means relying on components independent of the present will of the country or government. This last principle is essential, crucial, since it is a condition for the index to be used as a criterion for reallocation without creating moral hazard. A country should not be rewarded for present policy making it more vulnerable, but on the opposite, helped because its vulnerability independent of its present will. And these are strong consequences on the concept and measurement of resilience to be used. It's only the lack of structural resilience that should be included in the MVI as a factor of more allocation, while a poor resilience policy should be a factor of less allocation. An allocation formula such as the performance-based allocation used by the MDBs should then include both an index of structural vulnerability, besides the income per capita, of course, and an index of performance, including an assessment of resilience policy. I should say that there is some progress in the international community to recognize this principle and to make, by this way, the allocation more equitable, effective, and transparent. But the MDBs are still reluctant to their application, by some way preferring a curative treatment to the preventing one of vulnerability, while what we propose corresponds to a preventive treatment. To fill the gap between the UN MVI approach and the MDB's practice, a more rigorous and acceptable design of MVI is needed, what FERDI is trying to do now. And finally, since the internationally comparable indices cannot capture all the aspects of vulnerability and resilience, it has been recommended by the UNGA resolution that vulnerability and resilience profiles be set up, what was already done to a limited extent by the CDP, but should now be done at the country level. I should say that maybe an opportunity for GDN and is a motivation for the workshop to be held tomorrow, moderated by Dr. Soso Feidunu from FERDI. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with no further delay, I would like to open up for questions to our esteemed panelists. I think the best way to do this is take 3 questions. I think we have roving mics. Is that correct? Do we have some roving mics around? Thank you. And so we'll take 3 questions. And if you could please speak up clearly and address the question to a particular panelist, that would be great. Thank you very much.
My name is Pallavi. I'm from India, Bangalore, and I'm from a conservation organization, but I work in the space of environment education. It's, as Simon said, English is a very poor language to describe the kind of empowering education work that we do. So I stick to the words of environment education. My question is to both Susao and Simeon, because I also work with the indigenous communities in India, which we call Adivasi communities. And the work that we do is around education for Jal, Jungle, Jameen. These are the three totems for us, which are the ecosystem education, where with critical pedagogy, with empowering ideas, how do children become the custodians or stewards of their own ecosystems. The problem is, and I have been struggling with it for the last 10 years, I run a course on indigenous visions called Living Utopias. I have not had good indigenous leadership in the communities, and something that Susao mentioned, often when we work with the communities, they look at us who are allies of this kind of work as project funding. So it's almost like NGOization of these ideas, and they look at us as people coming in and then going away, and the leadership becomes an NGOized leadership. So what my question to both of you is that, when you do critical pedagogy, when you do a lot of empowering education, there is a mainstream school education that works in another way. They are not interested in having these ideas. And I'm finding that indigenous communities in India also want to belong to this schooling. They also want to become where English is taught. They do their class 10 and their class 12 so well that they become assimilated in the mainstream society. And somehow we are not able to crack this puzzle. How do you guys do it, is my question.
Okay, well, that's a good question. We'll take that, and we'll take a couple more questions, and then we'll go over to Simi and Doris. Up here, please. The gentleman in the red shirt.
Red shirt.
Having worked on projects in the Caribbean, we have a couple of countries in the region that have indigenous populations. And one of the things that we noticed was that going into these communities with translators is one thing, but getting individuals within those communities to speak up, it's another thing. So it's not just a barrier of language, it's also a barrier of confidence. So what we find is that when outsiders go into these villages in their shirts and their ties and stuff like that, it can come off as being intimidating. So we want to hear their voices. We want to have policies that include what they want to say, but it's difficult to kind of break that silence and get the confidence, to get them to have the confidence to speak up. What we find is that also when you have translators that come in from the cities and they go into these communities, that doesn't quite help to break that barrier either. So other than ensuring that we have translators to get indigenous voices into the conversation, what can we do to also have that issue of confidence in? And just to quickly add that we did some research recently and found that it's not even just at the indigenous level. We found that out here in the Pacific, during the pandemic, when you didn't have much consultants flying into these countries, locals took more leadership of projects because the absence of outsiders gave them the confidence they needed to step out there and step into their roles. How can we address this issue? Thank you.
So just, is that for any of the panelists?
Any other but the gentleman who spoke on indigenous issues, but obviously anybody can.
So essentially the question is, how do we build confidence of indigenous leaders to step into the space?
Yes, yes.
Good, thank you. And one last one, over here, the lady up there, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll ask when I'm seated. To the gentleman in the middle, my question is addressed to you as you're into the health sector. When you look at climate change and health, it is one of the most pressing issues, but one of the most difficult to understand, if I could say. You talked about heat waves, which are there, but to some people, they really don't believe there is a close relationship between heat waves and health impacts. And why? Because it is very difficult to quantify the impact. For example, we talk about hypertension, but it has been there for years. So when you tell me heat waves leads to increased hypertension, I would find it hard to understand. And that is in regards to all other diseases. For example, malaria, you will tell me, okay, climate change leads to an increase in malaria, but we've had malaria since the 70s also. So how best can this be addressed to make sure that this is climate change related malaria and not the normal malaria or whatever disease that is in place? How best can it be streamlined? Because when you tell me climate change leads to this and it has been in place for long, it is something I don't understand very well. What is climate change related and what is non-climate change related in regards to health? That is it.
Thank you. Good luck with that one. I might leave that one just for you to think about, and then I will go over to Doris and Master Simi. The question was how do we challenge conformity of Indigenous culture in education? How do we make sure that there's not such mainstreaming that it loses its Indigenousness, if that's a word? Simi, do you want to have a go? There's a microphone coming now.
In 2021, I worked for 2020. I worked for an entire year with an indigenous community to address the resilience, but we used the pathway of the language and the values, the collective, their dialect was almost on the verge of not being spoken, and they wanted it back. And you know, everything is linked, and when the dialect began to come back, it also brought in Kato, all the values. But I reiterate Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, if a tradition gathers strength over centuries, one does not turn it off overnight. On the flip side, when it has been turned off, it needs about a century to take it back on. So I worked with this community for an entire year, meeting them where they are at. So these are elders, and meeting in the community hall, I did not come with an air of authority. I ensured that when I spoke, I used the traditional mediator who made the initial presentation. So that's the cultural sensitivity. And once the elders knew and accepted me in the space, then I began, it was like playing chess, just dropping one, going back, dropping. And this rhythm took an entire year for them to reconnect, but at their own pace. And I did not come with a shirt, coat, and tie. I ensured I dressed as simply as I could to blend with them. And no airs, not I'm so-and-so from this department. That is very neo-colonial. It just pushes the community away and says, okay, here's the Mr. Smart, knows it all. Let him or her talk, and let's just watch patiently as the culture would require. So, and also, there is this skill, not only for the Pacific, but all indigenous communities, where listening is like the psychological listening. We are not only listening to the words, because people in the community, they don't come up openly. They beat around the bush. They use metaphors. The trick is listening to what is not said, listening to the silences, and listening to the backstory. And that is a process, so that takes time. Because why does it take time? the trust. They cannot just divulge everything in an hour of sitting. The trust is what I mentioned, the relational. So when I go to communities, I select the indigenous identity of mine from either my maternal or paternal or grandparents, and I foreground that. They can connect with that. I don't bring my professional capacity because nobody connects with that. So it's building connections and going forward with those connections. And to empower the three guiding mantras here, there is a right time, a right place, and a right space. An example, there was this 80-year-old matriarch who had knowledge about a traditional basket instead of the plastics, but to get to her, we had to lie on the mat this way and push aside the recorder and talk about her grandparents, grandchildren, and her days growing up, and then the conversation. So it's doing it in an indigenous way, honoring the ethics and how they're comfortable, where they're comfortable, and honoring the positions, the space, keeping the distance respectful. All these nuances are not taught, but they can be learned. They can be learned. So empowering them. And there's this, when I was still in the government agency, we went out to gather traditional knowledge. And there was this new field officer, just signed up. And I did the initial presentations and training in the office. When they were about to be dispatched, kava is common here in Fiji in the Pacific. And I said to him, hey, I called him by his name. Make sure you have a black belt in kava drinking. I said, what? You are going to the community. Do I need to? Yes, you have to. I don't. My religion, your religion does not matter here. You go. So long story short, he came back.
Thank you.
And I asked him, how did it go? He said, man, you were right. The first day we sat in the community hall, drank kava from 10 a.m. till 10 p.m. Did you die? No. And then the next day we did it again, 10 a.m. till 10 p.m. Bravo. And the third day, they opened up. You know why? They wanted to test your tolerance. If you were comfortable in their space, you are worthy. So just it's meeting them where they are. In a nutshell, I don't know whether I've answered that question, but
No, thank you very much, Mr. Seymour. Very nice. I'm gonna go to Doris next. Sorry, after I'm really dying to hear what's the difference between climate malaria and normal malaria. You gotta how do we distinguish this? How do we see the
It's science. Full stop.
Yeah.
These studies have been done. It's been demonstrated. Yes, I know we live in a post-truth world. So maybe the question is really about how do you communicate this? But I can give you 5 papers straight away that actually document this. And there's methods, scientific methods, environmental epidemiology methods of counting this.
Thank you. There you go. That was a very
Nice
concise
try.
answer. Very nice. And Doris, how do we build confidence? I mean, I've been on many conferences with you, and you often talk about confidence building and is more important than capacity building. How do we build confidence of young Indigenous leaders in the Pacific? I'm super keen to go to another 3 questions. So if you could be super quick, that'd be good. Thank you.
Thank you. I will be super quick. I first would like to acknowledge Mr. Sevundrendra's detailed response. And we, as an organization, we have had the privilege to have had his wisdom with us in the community. So I think just responding very quickly to that initial question, as an NGO, how do you do this? Well, we don't have the technical expertise nor the wisdom and lived experiences. So what we did was look out beyond live and learn to find resource personnel. And Mr. Simeone, was our resource in our climate resilient islands program. And again, you know, going back to communities, we learned a lot from that experience with Mr. Sevendred, and I just would like to acknowledge him for that. Super quick response. Youth and climate leaders, how do we do that in the communities? I think, again, it's, you know, community or working in communities where we spend most of our time. It is not writing in and writing out. It is a lengthy process. We have to have the endurance for community development work. And it is through that patience and spending time in our communities that we identify, together with community elders, who these young, interested individuals are. Usually, you know, the males put their hands up, but we also work to looking at identifying young women. And I think you'll hear more about this in the workshop after tea or lunch, a leadership program. So again, apart from their traditional roles, that we are also keen to have communities identify that they can play leadership roles. There are others within the community who also are keen, and perhaps it's because of their exposure. So it's working first with those who express interest and then providing them with the support. And one of our support that we've had over the years in terms of climate resilience and working with young people or communities is, again, working with wisdom and guidance from someone, an individual, a valued individual in our area of work like Mr. Simeone. So it's probably not about us, it's really finding for our communities the best resource that they can be connected to, and that we can also learn to be respectful, because trust and trusting, as Mr. Simeone had mentioned, is really an important value that not only the organization has to have, but we must ensure we have that developed with our people that we work with.
Vinaka, Doris, very interesting. I think I've been shown the card at the back here, so unfortunately we have to close, and I will encourage you to take your questions to our panelists after the session. I do want to leave you with one thought though, and when I was a lot younger, I had a radio program in Far North Queensland, and I had the pleasure of interviewing David Suzuki from Canada, the University of British Columbia. I don't know whether any of you know David Suzuki, but he's a Canadian geneticist. He's studied for 6 years the brains of fruit flies, and he became one of the most prominent science communicators during the 80s and 90s. And on this radio show, I asked him, is it too late to do anything about climate change? Are we too far gone? And he said, absolutely not. We don't know enough to ever say we're too late for anything. We don't know enough about nature to ever say it's too late. We have to keep fighting, and we have to keep persevering. And I think the example that he gave me was an example from Fraser River in British Columbia. Every year, 150 million salmon migrates into the river. And at some stage, the volume, the biomass of salmon was so low that it would not reach the hills of the river and spawn. And the Canadian government declared the sockeye salmon extinct. And it disappeared for about 6 years. And suddenly there was the biggest migration ever seen of sockeye salmon migrating into the Fraser River. In much more than 200 million salmon migrated into the river. And David Suzuki's point was that if we give nature a chance, and if we give her space, she will be able to surprise us. And the only thing that will not happen, she will not be able to surprise us if we give up. So we have to be fearless and keep fighting. And that's my alarm clock ringing. Thank you very much. Please thank our esteemed guests. Vinaka Vakalebo, thank you so much.